Here are 5 common myths about Japanese that I'm kind of tired of seeing online as someone who studies Japanese for a living. Throughout all these, I'm going to talk about why they're wrong, where they come from, and to give credit where credit is due, recognize if there is any truth kind of behind them. Number 1, the idea that Anata is a rude second-person pronoun. This is a really clickbaity explanation that people use to make people feel bad about using the term, and it's just simply not true. If you look in any dictionary, you can find descriptions like this. Clearly say aite o sonchou shite, or show respect, or this one here, which says it's appropriate to taito or joi, so at the same level or above you. What's really unfortunate about this kind of framing of things is that saying Anata is rude is an incorrect framing that I think is trying to solve an issue that actually does exist, which is that as a second language learner of Japanese, you're probably using Anata too much. There's no question that people learning Japanese in languages that use the word you a lot say you way more frequently than Japanese people do. For instance, just as an obvious example, it's way more natural just to say onamae wa rather than anata no onamae wa when talking Japanese, and you should try to remember that when speaking Japanese. Indeed, Japanese as a language does not like second-person pronouns, and whenever possible, using someone's name, using their title, or again, just dropping is preferable. But there are some situations where this is not possible. Say, for instance, you're walking down the street and you see a Japanese person's wallet fall out of their pocket and you pick it up. Now your English brain will probably think you should say, oh, is this your wallet? Which would be, anata no saifu desu ka? You can't drop anata here because then it becomes saifu desu ka, which is just, is this a wallet? Which is an entirely different question, which would be pretty confusing. As your Japanese gets more advanced, or as you watch how Japanese people actually phrase things, you may realize that, oh, okay, I can just say, like, sumimasen, saifu o toshimashita ka, as, oh, did you drop your wallet? And without saying you. But if you were to tap the Japanese person on their shoulder and say, sumimasen, anata no saifu desu ka? That's fine. That's okay. No Japanese person is going to go home with like a scowl on their face and their partner's going to be like, what's wrong? And like, oh, this baka gaijin gave me my wallet back, but they call me Anata. It's not going to happen. It doesn't happen. It's fine. If you're like, oi, teme, saifu otoshita ze, or like, omae saifu otoshiyagatte, yeah, then that might not go over pretty well. But Anata itself is not rude. Try to avoid using it, but don't feel bad when you do. The second pernicious myth I see is that Japanese doesn't have sarcasm. And this is one that's commonly spread by early mid-level Japanese learners that are overconfident and want to show off how much they know. And I know this because I spread this myth. I was a low to mid-level Japanese learner who was overconfident and wanted to show off how much he knew. The fact of the matter is that Japanese absolutely has sarcasm. The problem is that you're not good enough to understand it. What's going on here is that sarcasm is actually like a really complicated linguistic feature because you're basically saying something but you don't mean it, which is sort of the opposite of what language is supposed to do outside of like lying. And more importantly, sarcasm is heavily culturally defined. And I don't mean cultures here as in like geographic entities, but even just groups of people. I grew up in the 1990s in America, which I kind of feel is like peak sarcasm in American culture. And of course we have like the sarcasm voice. Sure, you know what I'm talking about. And yeah, Japanese doesn't have that. I would say that definitely Japanese sarcasm is kind of much less pointed and cruel than it kind of manifests often in America as well. But this is not something that is universal to sarcasm. Shows that I thought were funny because they were sarcastic were not interesting to my parents. And I remember meeting a bunch of British people when I was working in Japan, and they were showing me sarcastic British humor, and a lot of times I just didn't get it because it was different. So that's really the key thing. Japanese sarcasm is different. And because sarcasm is a really, really difficult language feature, understanding sarcasm in another language takes years and years and years. I personally would not consider myself an expert on identifying it. That said, not to scare you, one common element of sarcasm in Japanese is the overuse of polite forms. So yeah, most of the time when people say "Nihongo jouzu desu ne," they do mean it as a compliment. That is supposed to be a compliment. But if they were gonna be sarcastic, that's probably one of the ways they would do it. Anyway, moving on to another thing that people claim Japanese doesn't have, but it absolutely does, is swearing. There are a few reasons that people believe Japanese doesn't have swearing, or doesn't have very much swearing. One is that they come from an English context, and English has a lot of swearing, especially compared to other languages. The F word especially is incredibly productive, and that's why it's been borrowed into so many other languages, including Japanese. It's rare for a word like the F word to exist. It's kind of crazy. It even violates some fundamental rules of English. You're not supposed to be able to have infixes in English, but like absa effing lutely is something that you can do in English, even though you can't normally do that. Other issues then are more universal. For instance, studies on translation of vulgarity note that oftentimes people feel that the vulgarities in their language are really harsh and the ones in other languages are not, which causes some problems in understanding how much vulgarity actually exists between the languages. On top of that, a lot of people, especially those speaking European languages, come from a Eurocentric perspective where vulgarity is defined by individual words, again, like the F word. You look for a specific vocabulary word to determine vulgarity. And in contrast, in a lot of Asian languages, Japanese and Korean being key examples, vulgarity is actually often coded grammatically. Just as a key example, F-U in English, the offensive part is the F part, right? Not the U. But in a lot of Japanese translations of this, the offensive part is going to be the word you, the choice of the word you. And that's kind of hard to explain and understand. How can you be offensive? Like, oh, you, right? That's never going to be bleeped on TV. But calling someone teme, kisama, etc. is not a way to make friends in most Japanese contexts. So what this means is it manifests differently. And yeah, look, Japanese people do sometimes like to pretend that their language has no swearing. There's plenty of nonsense assertions that Japanese has no swearing from non-Japanese people, as you can see in this example here, but there have been academic studies where people have interviewed Japanese people and they say, oh, no, our language doesn't have any swear words. And that's a nice thought. It's a nice way to present the language, but it's not true. That person might not swear, but the idea that there aren't any swear words is just false. If Japanese wasn't filled with swear words and offensive terms and ways of insulting people, how could a dictionary of offensive terms, which if you get a copy of this, it's a very fun read, exist in the language? If you don't believe Japanese has swearing or vulgarity, just go around calling your boss, your partner's parents, random people at formal meetings that you've met for the first time, kisama, or using the meirei-kei to them, and see how well it goes, and then you can report back. The fourth common myth is that Japanese men's language and women's language are kind of stable entities that can always be expected and have existed forever. As I'm sure many of you know, compared to English, Japanese does have a lot of features that are associated with gendered speech. For instance, certain first-person pronouns are unquestionably more commonly used by men, while certain sentence final particles are unquestionably more commonly used by women. But this is not something that is absolute by any means. There's a sort of an impression that Japanese is just one language and everyone across the entire set of islands says it the same way, but that's not true at all. The differences between dialects can be extreme to the extent of unintelligibility, and that includes not just how things sound, but how things are used. And if you go back in history, basically none of the features you see now are guaranteed to exist in the past or be seen in the same way. A lot of what we assume about how men speak and how women speak in Japanese started to appear around the mid-late 1800s. Or that many features now that are associated with one group or the other, found in literature about equally between characters of both groups. Indeed, if you go back before that, a lot of the terms that were used by different groups were more related to kind of class. Yeah, there are things like nyobo kotoba, or the speech of aristocratic women in Kyoto, but this is a very, very small segment of the population. It's also not hard to look through media and find examples of characters using forms that they're not supposed to. Women using masculine terms like you can see here, or men using quote-unquote feminine terms. And yes, sometimes these are part of exaggerated or intentional gender performances, but the other times they're just sort of normative for the character. These specific forms always do have some kind of social meaning behind them, and there are always people that tut-tut and wave their fingers whenever someone deviates from what they're quote-unquote supposed to do, but the idea that these are absolute is definitely not true, and this is not something that's changed recently. This is something that has existed throughout the entire history of Japanese. One really funny thing that you find when you look through research on, for instance, women's language in Japanese is that basically in every single decade of Japanese history, as far as we have data going back, there are people writing to newspapers to complain about women using men's speech. But if women are using quote-unquote men's speech, then by definition, it's not really men's speech, is it? It's just speech. Finally, and perhaps most perniciously, is the idea that Japanese people are especially polite because their language has keigo, kenjogo, and other features that are associated with politeness. First and foremost, having politeness in your language does not make you inherently polite. It's totally possible to ignore any feature of your own language. Most importantly though, so-called polite forms are not inherently or always polite. In some cases, they're just sort of normal. A few years ago, I was reading this book, and this chapter here kind of had an oh wow moment for me, as it framed san as not something used to show politeness, but something just used to show a normative level, because if everyone's using something that's not polite, it's the norm. So it actually argued that san was not a polite form, but rather just a not impolite form, which was an interesting perspective. Indeed, from a contemporary linguistics, especially sociolinguistics perspective, if you're using polite forms just because you have to, then it's not polite. What it's showing is a type of social interaction rather than actual politeness. And indeed, of course, anyone who's worked in retail or anything like that in English-speaking context knows that there are times that you use polite terms when what you're really thinking are very, very impolite things, and that's very true in Japanese as well. There's a fascinating series of videos on how to use keigo that were produced by the NHK HK, and there's a scene in one of them that I don't know if it was intentional, but it's really an amazing educational moment because you can see two employees talking to each other casually, and then when one says, "I'm going to go home," the other says, "Hey, wait, I have work for you. This is our work as a team." The one who's going to go home gets frustrated and switches to Keigo, not to show politeness, but actually to put distance between her and the other person. They were friendly, but now they're mad, so they're using Keigo to show that anger. You can check out the clip here.
私ちょっと先に帰るけど、一人で頑張れる？って何よ？
明日までです。これお願いします。
なんだその上から目線は。
我々のチームのノルマなんです。
はいはい、わかりました。手伝いますよ。
何卒よろしくお願い申し上げます。
Indeed, check out this quote from a research project that I did, where a Japanese metal artist talks about how they don't want to use plain form in their songs because it sounds too friendly, whereas polite form, which may seem unmetal in a way, is actually preferred because it says, "You and I will not become friends." Indeed, one of the most fascinating things about actually paying attention to how Japanese people speak is that in actual meetings, in business contexts, etc., the use of Keigo, the use of polite form, the use of casual form will come and go. This article here, which is from that book I mentioned earlier, you can see this table, which looks at the use of polite forms throughout a Japanese meeting. And as you can see, there is no part of the meeting where one specific form is used all the way throughout. But it's not like the meeting is impolite. Sometimes using polite form is not saying, "Hey, I'm being polite to you," but "Hey, I'm being official." Indeed, Keigo, etc. can be sort of performative, as in a teacher who's speaking casually with their students, but then will switch to polite form not to suddenly be more polite to them, but to show that they are now taking over as the teacher and moving to a new topic of discussion. In short then, politeness is a label, just like, say, vulgarity. And just like people don't use vulgarity always to be vulgar or because they are inherently vulgar, people don't use politeness to necessarily be polite or because they are inherently polite. What the existence of things like Keigo, Kenjogo, etc., polite form, plain form, etc. in Japanese shows us is that these grammatical choices are important and play an important role in navigating day-to-day life. That doesn't mean that Japanese people are inherently polite people, but it does certainly mean that they have to make more decisions about which forms they're using while speaking. And while this of course brings about complexities for you as a learner of Japanese, as you master this you will learn new ways of expressing yourself and new ways of negotiating situations, which can be incredibly useful and exciting. So those are my 5 complaints. I hope you found them interesting, and it'd be great if you all just stopped making videos that asserted them. I'm sure you will continue to do so though, because they'll be way more popular than this video is. Thanks for your time.